When you're a kid, imagination is limitless and inspiration can come from anywhere. So when 7-year-old Jeremy Rowan had to choose a costume for Dress as Your Idol Day at school, he knew exactly who he wanted to be. This is Jeremy, and this is who he chose to dress up as, poet Amanda Gorman, who he says recites poetry like it's a song. She is America's first youth poet laureate, and like millions of people, Jeremy was mesmerized by her grace, her dignity, and her words at the inauguration of U.S. President Joe Biden.
When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it.
She stepped into that moment of history and took people's breath away. There is a renaissance in poetry right now, and it's not just driven by Gorman. There are plenty of emerging, eloquent poets, including here in Canada, whose voices are rising. Robin Gill has the story of some of them.
I was an ocean once. Bare shoulders and whale song in my rib cage, I watched as the rigs drilled holes in my body. They left no part of my trenches unmanned.
Poetry has always been a form of art, but rarely a career.
Turned me into a war instead of a homecoming. I should have evaporated sooner.
And yet Nisha Patel has managed to make this a full-time gig.
It's definitely not the sexiest job to dream of when you're, 10 years old. Other jobs seem more important, seem bigger, seem, wider in their scope, seem like they're going to reach more people. But to dream of being an artist in the literary sense is very different.
This place is a love song, a changing season's memoir, a passage of time captured in the buildings and the businessman's dreams.
The 28-year-old's dream came true when Edmonton picked her as the city's poet laureate.
There's a level of recognition that comes into being a poet laureate. And so a lot of your words are not taken, lightly. You're able to occupy a space that the public is able to see.
Like a lot of young poets, she taught herself by reading it. That's how Toronto's Andrea Josic got her start.
Uber driver jaw opens. A boa constrictor after fast. There are other women in his molars. This is a second dusk. I was always very interested in writing ever since I was a kid, and for the longest time I thought that writing had to be limited to a page and to publications and to books.
As a shy teenager, she started entering slam poetry competitions, and the words inside her started flowing out.
What I like about poetry is how healing it can be. It feels like a place of complete liberated self-expression. It feels like a place where however you're feeling that day or however you're feeling in that moment can be fully released.
I stand on stolen land, watch as flash flood and acid rain embraces home. On the news, a pig swims and the world sees resilience.
Born in the Philippines, now living in Vancouver, Ivy Haddad was taking journalism courses and decided to delve into creative writing.
I bend water to words, mahalaga ang katawan na lumulutang sa agos ng bagyo. The cost of a body is an empty home. I had to take a poetry class, even though I hated poetry at the time. And then I dipped my toes into it.
Okay, let's rewind.
Yeah.
You actually hated poetry when you first started creative writing, and now you're a poet.
I never knew that I could have the mental capacity for it.
The immediacy of it is part of its charm, part of poetry's charm and power.
Kevin Connolly is the poetry editor at the House of Anansi, a publishing company. He says poetry plays an important role in times of turbulence and unease, like during a pandemic.
I think in times like this, people are at a loss for words. I often ask people how they're doing. People are having a really awful time, and many people whose life isn't all that changed. And a lot of them are at a loss for words. They can't quite distill it. And I think a poem can do that because it's so specific to a moment, a particular person's experience, even something that happened that day.
He sees a surge of young poets, especially ones from marginalized communities. These poets recognize the moment they're in.
Some days I cannot see past the blood on my hands. I read names like a eulogy. The leopards, the gorillas, the elephants, the sea turtles, the rhinos, the tigers, oh God, how I had never wished to outlive the tigers.
When I first got into poetry, I was dealing with a lot of mental health struggles, and a lot of my poetry focused on mental health and focused on, moving through mental illness and existing with mental illness.
Josic frequently writes about sexual assault, gender issues, and her personal struggles.
And then as I started to unpack more of my healing, I moved towards dealing with survivorship and dealing with being, a femme body in a society that is very male-focused, and a society that discourages femininity and discourages the woman. For what are the boxes I encounter men in, but the packaging of their temptation? I am prayed into wrapping paper and reused at every convenience.
People write poetry out of a position of anxiety. They're much more comfortable with anxiety than regular people. That's their strength and their weakness, but at times like this, it seems like a strength.
Edmonton was one of the first cities in Canada to formally establish a poet laureate. In that role, Patel is the people's poet.
Your job as a poet laureate is to reflect the times and the thoughts and the feelings of the people. And a lot of my work as poet laureate has been, in some ways, more controversial because it's critical of the institutions around me.
She sure isn't kowtowing to the hand that feeds her. Here's her recent blistering attack on City Hall.
So I lay awake and wonder which part of the Municipal Government Act, Section 7, prevents the city from spending money in a crisis in the name of the safety, health, and welfare of people.
The fact Patel is able to make a living from her lyrics has inspired this rising poet.
Vancouver is a demolished rainforest surrounded by sacred mountains flattened for skyscrapers. Surrey is the pavement where Mama tells me to dream.
Poetry distills ideas down to a few words spread apart on a lot of white space. No wonder Instagram has been a vehicle for young poets. But critics of Insta poetry describe it as a few superficial lines thrown together and put into a square box. The Spectator writes, "The vast majority of Insta poetry is terrible, cliched, banal, derivative, portentous, repetitive, and manipulative."
I think, young poets are not always eloquent. Some of them have difficult feelings, complicated feelings, messy feelings, right? And to capture that spirit in poetry, even as they grow older, I think is more human than some of these old poets that are published in books that we study for like hundreds of years.
Patel herself uses Instagram, a platform she says helps spread the word, but that also comes with its challenges.
At the end of the day, I'm being put into this position where I have to look at engagement numbers. I have to look at whether a poem is landing in a good way, whether people are identifying with it. And that part it's like a worm that gets into my brain. And I'm really trying to reach a point with my writing where I'm at peace, where I can offer what I want into the universe, and I don't have to accept that social media metrics or how the universe is telling me that what I'm doing is right.
Connecting does depend on getting those likes. Chaucer and Eliot had to worry about followers and metrics, but it was a different era. Their works have generally been relegated to the musty corners of bookstores and libraries, but they're still taught by the old establishment.
Do you think that poetry is still in that realm of being traditional or elitist or exclusive anymore?
We're still preferencing people who go to school for writing. We're still preferencing people who sometimes have to write for 10 plus years in order for them to be heard.
They called me a coconut. Brown on the outside, white on the inside. Inside there is only 24 years of hollowing yourself out.
Patel didn't pursue publishing, but a book deal has landed in her lap. Coconut is her debut.
To be filled by someone else's expectations, so that you, like a real coconut, can be judged in the palms of others.
And I hope to continue to build momentum. I feel momentous. I feel like I'm caught up in something that is bigger than me, and I want to see that through till the end, whatever the ending might be.